Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome back to our African Union Smart Safety Surveillance Capacity Strengthening sessions. This is session 3 of Module 2 on Signal Detection and Management, and it builds upon yesterday's presentation from the MHRA Signal team on signal generation and signal management. Today we're joined by the lead of our signal management team, Lily Wells, at the MHRA, who will be taking us through, building upon yesterday's, some real examples of signals that have been discussed at the MHRA and the action that has followed. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Perhaps we can just go to the next slides. We can move the slides on. So again, this is the standing slide. We're joined by colleagues from across the African Union, from various stakeholder groups, but primarily from the 4 countries that we're actively working with in the African Union at the moment, in Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is the final module, final session of Module 2 on signal detection and signal management. We will be following up in March and April and May, building upon the pharmacovigilance process into benefit risk assessment, and then into safety communications and the role of expert advisory committees. Next slide, please. And the next one again, please. So just to recap, the aims of this module is to provide that high-level overview of signal detection and signal management. We covered causality assessment. We've covered signal generation yesterday, and now we're looking at the signal meeting and the concepts of running a good signal management meeting. Next slide, please. Just a reminder, I'm sure colleagues are now familiar that we have all attendees are on mute, and the raise hand function, whilst you will use it, we cannot respond to it. So we'd ask that you use the chat function for issues that are of a technical nature with the running of the webinar, but for questions to myself or Lily in this and in other sessions, other panelists, please use the Q&A function so we can pick up your questions in the best way. Next slide, please. So without further ado, Lily, over to you. Take us through this final module, please.
Morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Mick. As Mick said, my name's Lily Wells, and I'm the current Signal Management Coordinator at the MHRA. Myself and my team, some of which you've already heard from yesterday, help facilitate the management of signals within the Vigilance and Risk Management of Medicines Division at the MHRA. Next slide, please. So this slide gives an overview of what I plan to discuss in our session this morning. I hope to give an overview of what the signal management meetings are used for, who attends them, and how signals are prioritised using them. Whilst I appreciate that some of you on the call may not have similar systems and functionality to what we have at the MHRA, the concepts that I'll discuss and the structure of these meetings can be easily replicated in your own countries using the data that you do have available. I'll then go on to discuss how to assess a signal, tips of what to look for when reviewing a drug event combination, and then try to put it into practice with an example. Next slide, please. So you heard from my colleagues Sam and Anastasia yesterday, who gave an overview of the signal management process, and I'm just going to use this slide to recap for anyone that missed it, as I think it will be a nice introduction to what we plan to talk about today. So the diagram on the slide gives an overview of the signal detection and prioritisation process at the MHRA. ADR reports are received via a number of routes. For example, we receive them via paper or electronically. And the electronic ADR reports are received via our app, our website, or via various clinical systems. And our signals are our sources of signals are from these ADR reports, as I just described, but also from other sources. So we might receive signals from queries from members of the public or healthcare professionals, directly from pharmaceutical companies or other regulatory authorities, which is shown in point 1 on the slide. So once received, the ADR reports are then entered onto our database, Sentinel, and then uploaded to Empirica, which is the program we use for our signal detection. The signals are reviewed by a team of assessors, and then signals which meet a given criteria are presented at our signal detection meeting. So this is shown in points 2 and 3 on the slide. If further action is required on those signals, and by action I mean regulatory action, these signals are prioritised and presented at our signal management review meeting, in which the signal is evaluated and the next steps are agreed. So this is shown in points 4 and 5 on the slide. The next steps could involve various types of regulatory action. So it could be an update to the medicine's product information to add a new side effect in, or it could be that the MHRA want to communicate more widely on this particular safety issue. Or even at this stage, at stage 4, we might decide that actually after reviewing the evidence and that further assessment that we don't think further action is needed at all. Next slide, please. In the presentation yesterday, Anastasia and Sam described how signals are allocated out to assessors on a Monday of each week. So assessors will then have from the Monday to the Thursday to review their different drug event combinations and decide if they pose any cause for concern. On a Thursday, we then hold our first of these signal meetings, the signal detection meeting. And the attendees of this meeting are made up of a group of medics, pharmacists, and scientists. Management also attend this meeting. And the meeting is chaired by a pharmacovigilance information coordinator like myself. The chair will share their screen with the meeting and ask each assessor in turn whether they have signals that they would like to present to the meeting. If an assessor has a signal to present from their routine review that they were allocated on the Monday of that week, the chair will bring that particular drug event combination up on Empirica, our signal management system, so that everyone in the meeting can see the drug event combination and how many ADR reports we have for that particular combination, as well as the statistical scores associated with it, such as the EBGM. The assessor presenting will then present a high-level summary of the available evidence for that specific drug event combination or signal. They'll discuss how many adverse drug reaction reports we have for that particular signal, as well as any other adverse drug reaction reports that may be relevant. They will also discuss the reason that the signal has flagged or why it has met our criteria. And I believe these were also covered in yesterday's presentation, but just to give an example, it may be that the signal has arisen because it was from maybe a fatal report or a report concerning a child, or maybe it contains an alert term, which are medical conditions of interest. The assessor presenting may discuss a possible mechanism for how the drug might be causing the reaction. They may also choose to present any evidence from the literature or online forums, or any further evidence really that might further support the signal. To conclude their presentation, the presenter will then summarise the evidence that they've presented and propose whether they feel that we need to take regulatory action or not. Based on the information presented to them, the other attendees in the meeting may ask questions to the presenter to further clarify their understanding, and the meeting will then discuss whether or not they agree with the proposed action and come to a final position on this. It's important to note that presentations that are given at this first signal detection meeting are verbal and they provide just a high-level overview of the evidence available. The assessor isn't expected to fully research the signal at this first point. Each presentation differs in length depending on the complexity of the evidence, but typically lasts no more than 5 minutes. And this is to allow for plenty of time to discuss the signal with that group of assessors in the meeting. If the meeting feels that any form of regulatory action is needed, the signal will be presented at our next meeting, which is the Signal Management Review meeting, and that occurs the following Tuesday. It's also important to note that with this first signal detection meeting, the assessor can go to this first meeting being unsure of the action on their signal, and they use the other assessors in that meeting for their opinions and their expertise to give them guidance on the signal. So lots of signals that we take to this first meeting and that are presented by assessors, we may decide that we don't need to take any further action, but the assessor felt that they needed the confirmation from the group to confirm that they were making the right decision before they just dismiss the signal and move on. Next slide, please. So the Signal Management Review meeting, this is held on a Tuesday, and again is made up of a group of medics, pharmacists, scientists, as well as senior management. Prior to the Signal Management Review meeting, further assessment of the signal is required and all possible evidence is gathered and evaluated. This is communicated firstly through a written scientific report called the New Signal Report, which is circulated prior to the meeting and then briefly presented verbally during the meeting. Within this New Signal Report, the assessor will have reviewed all the ADR reports we have in our database, reports for similar MEDRA terms that may be of interest, or even looking at ADR reports for different drugs within the same class of medicines. They'll also consider all possible data sources that need to be consulted to provide additional evidence for consideration for this meeting. So this includes evidence such as literature, periodic safety update reports, the product information, or maybe available clinical guidance. The meeting will then evaluate the strength of the evidence and discuss the most appropriate action to take to bring about optimal patient safety outcomes. So ahead of this meeting, the assessors that will be attending are presented with a written summary of the signal, which they'll read ahead of the meeting, giving them time to form their opinions or ask questions to the assessor ahead of the meeting to maybe consider areas that they haven't looked at. Next slide, please. So at the Signal Management Review meeting, or SMRM, signals are prioritised to define the timeframes for regulatory action. This is done using the Regulatory Pharmacovigilance Prioritisation System, which is otherwise known as RPPS. RPPS is calculated ahead of the Signal Management Review meeting by myself and my team and confirmed within the meeting. And the purpose of the Regulatory Pharmacovigilance Prioritisation System is to ensure that resources are appropriately allocated and that acceptable timeframes are defined to meet public health requirements. 4 broad categories are considered as most relevant to determining the priority of a signal. And these are what we give special consideration to, and they're listed on the slide. So potential public health implications, agency obligations, the strength of evidence for causal effect, as well as public perceptions. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on these on my next slide. So next slide, please. So the RPPS scoring considers all the different aspects shown on the slide. So we look at UK exposure data. So our kind of threshold for this is 100,000 users. So is the UK exposure for that drug greater than 100,000 users? We also look at the frequency of the ADR. So how many ADR reports do we have and how often is this event potentially occurring? We also look at the health consequences. So this one considers things such as case fatality. So we look at whether people are dying due to the adverse event. And if it's not a fatal event, what impact does that ADR have on the patient's life? Is it just an inconvenience, maybe something like a headache? Or does it cause permanent major disability to that individual? We also look at the strength of evidence for a causal effect. So here we consider the evidence that the assessor will have gathered. So we'll look at whether there's more than one data source supplying the evidence. As if there's more than one data source supplying the evidence, it provides more evidence for that causal effect. So for example, do we have spontaneous adverse drug reaction reports and an observational study? This would strengthen the evidence for a causal effect. We also consider the agency obligations. So this would consider whether maybe there's ministerial concern over the drug, or if there's been a recent question in Parliament regarding this drug. We also consider the public perceptions criteria, and this considers whether the signal is likely to get significant media attention, whether it's likely to cause fright to the general public, or maybe whether misperceptions about the safety could be expected to cause further harm. And that last point is particularly important with regards to vaccine uptake. If we have a particular signal in relation to a vaccine, if that causes fright within the general population, it might mean that the uptake of that vaccine is reduced, which will then have knock-on effects with regards to the disease that that vaccine is protecting against. Next slide, please. So RPPS determines the priority of a signal or a safety issue by considering different criteria. And within each of the 4 broad categories that I described previously, there are further kind of categories within those 4 broad categories. So the criteria are weighted according to their importance, and they may contribute between 1 and 4 points to an overall category score. In addition, a score of high, medium, or low is assigned to each of the 4 boxes shown on the slide. A priority of standard, increased, or top is determined by the total number of points calculated as the sum of these 4 category scores. And the target for issues in the top category, so the most important category, is 3 months. For those in the increased category, the target is 6 months. And for those in the standard category, the target is 12 months. Next slide, please. So the type of regulatory action we take and the route that we go about taking that regulatory action in is dependent on the type of license that the medicine has. Examples of the types of regulatory action we can take are seen on the slide. So we may contact the marketing authorization holder or the pharmaceutical company and ask them for additional data on the signal, or ask them to complete a cumulative review of the drug event combination. We also might request changes to the product information. So we might ask for a warning to be added to section 4.4, or we might ask for a side effect to be added to section 4.8. We can also make changes to the licensed indication or the contraindications to narrow or broaden them in line with the safety profile. We also might consider communicating more widely to healthcare professionals. And in very, very rare circumstances, the drug can be removed from the market if the risk benefit is affected. But just to kind of reiterate there, that's something that doesn't happen very often. Next slide, please. The MHRA also has the opportunity to seek advice from the Commission of Human Medicines, or CHM. The CHM advises on the safety, efficacy, and quality of medicinal products and is made up of a group of experts, and this is independent to the MHRA. It's made up of various expert advisory groups known as EAGs or EAGs, which are able to give advice on the safety of medicines. And examples of the various EAGs are listed on the slide. And they're made up of experts that specialise in those different areas. So you can see we have Medicines for Women's Health EAG, Paediatrics Medicines EAG, which will specialise in medicines used in children, And we also have a pharmacovigilance expert advisory group, which I believe my colleague Claire will give you a presentation on. I think it's scheduled for May. So we'll hear more about that then. So if following the signal management review meeting, the group at that meeting feel that the MHRA might benefit from further advice on a signal, they can submit a paper for consideration by CHM or one of its expert advisory groups. It should also be noted that we have two sets of signals that go to the pharmacovigilance expert advisory group. We have signals in which we're asking for specific advice because we feel that we need their advice before we make a regulatory decision. But we also have a routine standing paper that goes to the pharmacovigilance expert advisory group that contains all signals that have been presented at the signal management review meeting and details the regulatory action that we have decided to take. So it contains a short summary of all those signals, and the experts that sit on the pharmacovigilance expert advisory group also have the opportunity to comment on those. So we're not necessarily asking them for their specific advice on those signals, but they do have the opportunity to comment on them if they feel that that is necessary. Next slide, please. So ultimately, the decisions that the MHRA make at the meetings that I've just described are to improve the safety of medicines and vaccines for the general public. And patient safety is our main priority. So it's important that we communicate any regulatory updates that we make to the general public and healthcare professionals. The MHRA has various ways of communicating this regulatory action, which are listed on the slide. For example, updating the product information, communicating via social media, communicating via our drug safety update, and also using the MHRA website. And again, I think there's a further presentation planned on this in which you'll hear further information on all of those points listed. Next slide, please. It's important to realise that there's not a specific set of steps to follow when you're completing signal detection and assessment. Every signal is different and will require consideration of different factors. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and when we train signal assessors at the MHRA, we don't provide them with a kind of template for going about signal assessment or a flowchart of the steps to follow, because it's different for every signal that you evaluate. However, the bullets listed on the slide give some areas that are good to think about when an assessor is looking at a signal. So our scientists will consider the following areas. So the first one, biological plausibility. This is a reaction, or a reaction might be predicted from the known pharmacology of a medicine. So if we know that that medicine causes a reaction within the same system organ class that's already well known and well established, you could consider that it's biologically plausible that it might cause another reaction within that same system organ class. So to just give an example, it's well known that warfarin causes bleeding. So if an assessor was looking at a signal of warfarin and maybe nosebleeds, it would be considered that it would be biologically plausible for the drug to cause this reaction because of how well the drug is known to cause bleeding or hemorrhage. The next point concerns the timing of the reaction. So different reactions would typically occur within different timeframes. So some might develop within a few minutes or even seconds of the drug administration, but other reactions might develop days or weeks or months or even years after the administration of a medicine, and some may occur in the patient's offspring. So to give an example here, anaphylaxis would typically develop within a few minutes of drug administration. So if an assessor was reviewing a drug event combination and they had several ADR reports of anaphylaxis occurring with a drug, it would strengthen the signal if in those reports the time to onset was quite quick, within minutes or seconds, whereas if in those reports the the anaphylaxis onset was months later, it's very unlikely that it's actually this medicine causing the anaphylaxis. So the timing of reaction is important to consider and will be different depending on what that reaction is. We also look at the relationship to the dose, including positive re-challenges or de-challenges. Adverse drug reactions can be dose related and might occur when a patient increases their dose, and then the risk can be minimized by reducing the dose of the medication in that patient. We also look at the nature of the reaction. So if the symptoms disappear when the medicine's stopped, although it maybe is a coincidence, it suggests that those symptoms are associated with the medicine. And a reoccurrence of those symptoms, if the medicine's reintroduced, will again strongly suggest an association. We also consider that some clinical events are often caused or associated by medicines. So, for example, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, blood dyscrasias, or skin reactions are all commonly caused by medicines. So if we're assessing a signal of a drug and a particular skin reaction, we know that drugs often cause skin reactions, so we'll take that into consideration too when looking at that drug event combination. We also look at all other possible causes of the reaction aside from the drug. So to give an example, a suspected reaction, it might be a manifestation of an underlying illness to do with the patient's past medical history. It might be caused by another medicine the patient is taking, and that could include over-the-counter medicines or herbal medicines that they might not necessarily tell their doctor about. It might also be caused by an interaction of two of the medicines they are taking, or it might simply just be a coincidence. We also consider that drugs may behave differently under different conditions, and we consider the possibility of pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic interactions, but also interactions with food products or medical devices. It's also important to note here that we consider that a signal of disproportionate reporting does not necessarily indicate that there's a signal to be further investigated because of these other factors listed on the slide. So a signal might flag with disproportionality and that it's occurring more frequently than we would expect. But on review of those cases, it's clear that the reaction is actually being caused by other factors, such as the patient's past medical history. So it's important that we use a combination of the statistical methods, but also a review of those individual case reports to complete a thorough signal assessment. Next slide, please. So just to give a working example on the process that I've described today, and what other MHRA colleagues did yesterday. So on the slide, you can see a drug event combination of Bisoprolol and angioedema. You can see that there's 10 UK ADR reports, and the EBGM is 0.585. So the EBGM is not raised. There's no disproportionality with this signal. So this signal was allocated out to an assessor on a Monday to review in their weekly signal allocation. And the assessor that was allocated it thought it posed a public safety concern. So once they've reviewed, they presented it at the Thursday signal detection meeting that I described earlier. So the screenshot on the slide is what the chair shows to the attendees of that meeting. So they have the high-level overview of the drug, the event, the number of UK cases that we have, as well as the disproportionality scores. So the meeting were told that the case that came in that caused this signal to flag, also known as the index case, concerned a 75-year-old female taking Bisoprolol for atrial fibrillation. She then went on to develop angioedema, a dry facial rash, and a rash on her legs and arms. The assessor also described that in the 9 other cases we have of bisoprolol and angioedema, 6 list bisoprolol as the only suspect medication to cause the side effect. So here, just picking up on that piece of evidence, so of the 10 cases that we have of bisoprolol and angioedema, 6 of them didn't list any other medications within the case. So that strengthens the cause for the signal in that the case isn't confounded by other medications. So there isn't other medications in those cases that could be causing the angioedema in those patients. So it's pointing more towards bisoprolol. The cases concerned a range of male and female patients that were all aged over 50, which again, I guess is what we would expect for bisoprolol. It's used for hypertension, which is typically more prevalent in patients over 50, and it occurs in both males and females. So when the assessor reviewed those 6 cases that weren't confounded by other medications, the onset times ranged from the same day to 7 days to 10 days to around 50 days. And going back to what I described earlier, with something like angioedema, it being an allergic reaction, we would expect that onset time to be quick. So with the case where the onset time was around 50 days, I would say that maybe wasn't as biologically plausible as the one that happened the same day. The assessor also looked at similar terms, which again is something I mentioned earlier. So as you can see from the screen, bisoprolol and angioedema is the event, or is the signal that's flagged. So angioedema is the MEDRA preferred term that's flagged. But if you think about the nature of angioedema, it includes swelling of maybe the lips or the face or the throat, which are all also MEDRA preferred terms that, if we have cases for bisoprolol and those terms, would add strength to the causal effect for this signal. So the assessor looked at the MEDRA PT for swelling face, and they found 7 additional cases that were not included in these 10 cases that we've looked at here. And again, the EBGM wasn't raised at 0.618. 5 of those 7 cases list bisoprolol as the only suspect medication. So again, there isn't confounding factors there. And the onset times ranged from a day to 37 days. Of note, it's also important that when an assessor is looking at these case reports, there'll be certain text maybe in the narrative of these ADR reports that further strengthen the signal. So obviously we can look at things like time to onset and if there's other medications in the cases. But to give an example, in one of our ADR case reports, the reporter noted that the patient was up titrated from 2.5 mg to 5 mg to 5 mg, and after one dose of the increased 5 mg, they awoke with a swollen face. They didn't have any pain or numbness, no difficulty in swallowing or movement, and the swelling resolved over the course of the next day. The next day they took the same dose, and again they woke again with the facial swelling, and they were advised to reduce the dose back down to 2.5 mg, and they haven't had any further facial swelling since. So this is an example of a positive re-challenge case, which further strengthens the signal, as the patient was given more of the drug, experienced the reaction, recovered, and then when they had the next dose, the reaction occurred again. And as I mentioned earlier, it could be a coincidence, but it's unlikely. So that illustrates the importance of looking into the individual case reports that you have for a specific signal. So when the assessor presented this to our Thursday signal detection meeting, they raised all of those points that I've just run through. And then they also referred to the product information for bisoprolol. So they noted that it lists hypersensitivity reactions such as itching or flushing or a rash, but it doesn't list anything more serious, which would cover facial swelling or lip swelling. The assessor also noted that another beta blocker, atenolol, so a drug within the same class as bisoprolol, lists in its product information that atenolol may cause hypersensitivity reactions, including angioedema, which was then reflected in the information that's given to the patient as allergic reactions. If you have an allergic reaction, see your doctor straight away. The signs may include raised lumps on your skin or swelling of your face, lips, mouth, tongue, or throat. The assessor here further strengthened their signal by referring to the product information of a drug in the same class as bisoprolol, so another beta blocker. So based on what the assessor presented to the meeting, there was some discussion which noted that angioedema can potentially be life-threatening if the throat swelling or the mouth swelling or the facial swelling is really severe. So based on that, and the evidence that we had pointing, which is quite strong considering there's a drug in the class that also lists the side effect. The reports that we have are quite strong in that we have quite a few, and within one of those there was that positive re-challenge case that I mentioned, where we increased the dose and the patient had the side effect. And the onset times, while some of them are implausible, the majority of them were plausible. So based on all of that evidence, the meeting agreed that the signal needed to be presented at the signal management review meeting. Next slide, please. So at the signal management review meeting following Tuesday, the assessor prepared the new signal report, which is circulated to attendees ahead of that meeting. In a snapshot of the new, or part of the new signal report is shown on the slide. So it discusses the 10 UK cases that we have in further detail, as well as any other supporting evidence for that signal. And the meeting attendees will read this report ahead of the meeting and form an opinion on the signal with regards to the proposed actions. So when the assessor comes to present this signal in the meeting, everyone's already had a chance to consider the evidence, and it leaves more time for helpful discussion. I guess in the meeting that happens on a Thursday, it's very high level, but on a Tuesday in the signal management review meeting, a lot more evidence has been considered. So it's a lot to take in if it was just a verbal presentation. So this written report allows the assessors to make the best possible decision they can based on the evidence that we have. Next slide, please. So at the signal management review meeting, the group concluded that we needed to write to the marketing authorization holder or the pharmaceutical company to request they update the product information for bisoprolol to include the risk of angioedema. So as you can see from the slide, the patient information leaflet, or the pill, was updated to include the lines, "You should speak to your doctor straight away if you experience more severe allergic reactions, which may involve face, neck, tongue, mouth, or throat swelling." You can also see that the summary of product characteristics, or the SPC, intended for healthcare professionals was also updated to include the risk of angioedema under the skin and subcutaneous tissues disorders section. Next slide, please. So just to touch on, as it was briefly mentioned yesterday, we do have another signal meeting at the moment concerning the COVID-19 vaccines. So following the introduction of these newly licensed vaccines, the MHRA introduced a daily COVID-19 signal meeting. And essentially, in this meeting, cases received the previous day are allocated out to assessors to review, and then they in the morning, and then they present those cases at the signal meeting that afternoon. As more doses of the vaccines have been given and we feel more comfortable with the safety profile of those vaccines, the meetings have transitioned to twice weekly. However, we are still reviewing that daily data. If any safety signals were identified from the data that we review and then present at these meetings, it would follow the usual process that I described earlier. So we would have the discussion at this initial signal meeting, and then if we felt we needed to take further regulatory action, it will be presented at the Signal Management Review meeting to confirm that regulatory action. We also have a dedicated COVID-19 expert working group, which, if we're not sure on what regulatory action to take, or we need more guidance on the evidence that we have, we can ask them for advice on these signals too, if appropriate. Next slide, please. So I hope my presentation today has brought together how our signal management process at the MHRA works. As you will have learned, we have various meetings to aid our signal management process, from the two that I've discussed in detail today, the Thursday signal detection meeting and the Tuesday signal management review meeting, to the other meetings surrounding the COVID-19 vaccines, and also the pregnancy meeting that Catherine touched on yesterday. So I hope we've been able to provide some helpful insight, but happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Lily. I think that was a really kind of putting some life into real life example of what was being discussed yesterday. So hopefully that was really useful for colleagues. As Lily said, use the Q&A box, get some questions coming in, and we'll do our best to answer them. We've also got Catherine Treguno, who was on the call on the session yesterday, and she'd also be happy to pick up any residual questions from yesterday or add value to this discussion now. Lily, struck me while you were talking that some signals merit more urgency than others. How quickly, typically, do we move from identification of a signal to taking regulatory action? And what's in your experience, the fastest we've been able to move?
I guess it depends on the severity of the signal and the impact that it could have on the patient population. But if it's something that's serious and it's something that we need to get out advice on immediately, especially kind of with the COVID vaccine stuff that's going on at the moment and how high profile that is. Obviously, we have these kind of standard meetings rolling on a Thursday and a Tuesday every week. But there have been instances in the past where we don't want to wait for that second review meeting because we know it's important and we know we need to act now. So we have in the past kind of called those ad hoc SMRMs that aren't in the Tuesday slot for those high profile safety issues. They don't happen very often, but obviously we have this framework in place that I've described and it happens every week. But it's not to say that it can't be adjusted and it's adaptable to those high profile issues.
And I guess, you mentioned COVID-19 vaccines there. I guess we saw very early on some cases of anaphylaxis and had to act very quickly there. And, it's not just always a case of updating the product information and waiting for that to trickle out. We use the media and other resources to communicate.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, you kind of touched on it a bit there, that obviously the product information, whilst it's an important source of information for a patient, when you update a product information, obviously a lot of that product will have already been manufactured and be in pharmacies or be in patients' homes already with the out of date leaflet in it. So it's important to recognise that whilst that is kind of like a standard regulatory action, sometimes more is needed to raise that awareness, which I think is what will be touched on in a later presentation with regards to our drug safety update and things like that.
Yeah. So we have had a question come in around risk minimisation measures. And have we got an example of a risk minimisation measure that's been introduced as a regulatory action?
I can give one briefly. I think Catherine might be better placed to answer this one than me. The one that I thought of immediately was with sodium valproate and the introduction of the pregnancy prevention plan. So that risk minimisation measure got introduced in order to make sure that any kind of women of childbearing potential taking sodium valproate were also on an adequate form of contraception. But that's one example, but Catherine will be better placed to give an answer to that one.
Catherine, welcome.
Hello, thank you. Yes, I mean, I'll start off by saying that in a later module, there will be a more of a deeper dive into exploring risk minimization measures. But just to give an idea, so we tend to divide risk minimization measures into either the routine measures or additional measures. And the routine measures are things like the product information, so the summary of product characteristics, as we call it in the UK and the EU, and the patient information leaflet. And also the legal status of the medicine, so whether you can buy it from any shop, or whether you have to go to a pharmacy, or whether it's something you can only get with a prescription, because there needs to be a bit more control over the use of that medicine. The additional risk minimization measures come in when you need something more active than just adding a side effect or placing a warning in the product information, which, as we know, is useful to have as a reference for healthcare professionals and patients, but doesn't always get looked at, especially if people are very familiar with the medicine that they're prescribing or they're taking. So an additional measure would be you could issue a letter, and we tend to call these Dear Healthcare Professional letters. So this would be a letter about a specific safety issue which has been identified, and these are quite often sent to accompany updates to SPCs, which might involve a new contraindication. So if you're saying with a medicine that it shouldn't be used in a certain population, that's really important. That's different to just adding a side effect, like Lily was talking about just now, which is something that people like to be aware of, what they might need to expect when they take the medicine. But something like a contraindication for use needs to stop the drug being used in a particular patient. So that might warrant something like a Dear Healthcare Professional letter as an additional risk minimization. Another example would be something like a patient alert card, which the patient is given when they take the medicine to carry around with them, so that either it reminds them about certain things. So, for example, some medicines, there's an antifungal medicine called voriconazole, which one of the risks that it's associated with is photosensitivity. So there's a patient alert card which is given to patients which take this medicine, which reminds them that they need to, avoid exposure to sun, so they need to wear sun cream, and also it might be, and this is with medicines where patients may end up kind of being in hospital. For example, a patient taking an anticoagulant medicine, one of the direct acting oral anticoagulants, carry alert cards to say that they are taking the medicine, so that the healthcare professional knows that they need to treat the patient in a certain way. Just trying to think of other risk minimization measures. Obviously, there's something like a pregnancy prevention program, or with antipsychotic medicines like clozapine, which are associated with severe blood dyscrasias. You have a situation where there's the patient has to have a blood test every so often to make sure that their bloods they haven't kind of fallen into have a low level of white blood cells, and which would cause them to be at risk of infection. So they need to have that blood test as a risk minimization measure to stop them from experiencing these side effects, which are quite serious, but because the condition that is being treated is serious, the patients need that treatment. So those are just a few examples.
Thank you both. Catherine, you mentioned there when a product's contraindicated in a particular population, that one of the things that I think increasingly do now is make use of the electronic prescribing system, so that if a doctor prescribes in that more at risk group or that contraindicated group, a warning can pop up on the electronic prescribing system to remind them of that fact and suggest possibly alternative treatments as well. So increasingly the use of these very clever electronic systems really does help with getting some of the pharmacovigilance messages out there. And that's been particularly used in sodium valproate, I know, as well. So increasing activity there. We've got another question around when there is, from Rebecca, when there is a signal of an adverse event in a patient, is there a framework in place to actively seek info from other patients to assess if they have a similar reaction? I guess, Lily, we use CPRD quite a lot to validate these kinds of signals rather than actively seek from patients themselves, but maybe you could explain, and Catherine might want to supplement.
Yeah, I think the important kind of point to note here is that our main method of collecting adverse drug reaction reports is via the yellow card scheme, and that's a spontaneous reporting system. So we don't actively kind of, whilst we encourage patients to report their side effects to us, we don't actively solicit those reports. As a first instance, and Mick kind of touched on it a little bit there, we would tend more to follow up with the patients that have reported to us to get the most information, or as much information as we can, around the side effect that they've experienced, and then look to other sources such as the CPRD, the evidence in the literature, maybe anecdotal evidence on patient forums, rather than actively kind of seeking out patients to report to us, because it kind of takes away the spontaneous aspect of the yellow card scheme. However, I think more so now we do have kind of patient engagement and public consultations with regards to kind of use of medicines, and whilst it's not necessarily maybe new signals, we do involve patients that have maybe experienced a side effect in the past and call for those patients to kind of give us their views and contribute when we're making kind of larger scale regulatory decisions with regards to a drug. So to give an example, at the moment we're calling for patients to provide evidence surrounding desogestrel, as we're currently considering to change it from a prescription only medicine to a pharmacy medicine. So we're asking patients to kind of come forward with their views in that sense, but I guess that's slightly different to the signal side of things. Catherine, I'm not sure if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what you could say is that if you've identified a signal and you think it's of concern, and you want to just highlight it to people, you want to communicate somehow, then sometimes by doing this that stimulates people to report their experiences. So and this is what's difficult about trying to measure the effectiveness of things like risk minimization measures. If you say, well, if we look at the numbers of ADR reports after we've issued this communication, then they should go down because people know about this risk. But conversely, sometimes, quite often, you find that the ADR reports go up because people, patients and healthcare professionals, are aware of that association. So when they see it, they think, oh, I'll report it to the MHRA. And that's still useful because it enables us to get perhaps more of a sense of how widespread or how much and a reaction is actually impacting patients' lives. So that's a kind of an indirect way. So it's not really asking people to tell us about things, but it kind of, it sets off the knowledge in people, so they kind of then tell us about these events.
Of course, Catherine, there's always the option, if we are concerned about a potential signal but have limited information, that we can either, if this has come up in clinical trials or an adjustment to the risk management plan, ask the company to conduct a study.
Yeah. So if it's something which was identified in clinical trials before the product was authorised in the risk management plan, which is a kind of a document which is agreed at the kind of authorization stage with a proactive plan to establish and further characterize the risks that are associated with that medicine. But then it kind of carries on throughout the life cycle of the product. But in the UK and in the EU, these risk management plans, you can ask the company to commit to conducting these kind of studies, and the legislative framework that we have allows us to do that. So the company has an obligation to conduct such a study, and then, you know, it gives further information on the signal, and also gives us a way of saying that, you know, that the company has a responsibility of maintaining the positive benefit risk balance for that product. And if they don't, then we can, you know, take action to, you know, to stop the product from being used. But yes, the companies do have obligations to look into these kinds of signals. I mean, that tends to be easier if you've got a product which it's a new product and there's not many different brands of that product. With older generic type products like older antibiotics, and there's many products now which where there's lots of generic versions available. It's not always so easy to work out which company has to do the work, but you know, it's still an option.
Yeah, I saw a couple of hands being raised. If I could ask to use the Q&A function again rather than raise hands, because we don't have a way of unmuting you and asking you to ask your question. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand, the Q&A box. Thank you. So in the absence of any other questions, we just give a couple of minutes in case anyone is typing in the box. But anything, Lily, that you want to add, or Catherine, from yesterday, anything you think you want to follow up on that we didn't get, because we had quite a few questions yesterday, we didn't get to the end of them all. Is there anything you just want to pick up on that?
Yeah, and I suppose I know Tyra said yesterday that we, will provide some written responses to the questions which were raised yesterday, and I was just having a look through them, and there was one question asking whether adverse event of special interest means the same as adverse event following immunisation. And it can get quite confusing because, there are lots of acronyms that are quite the same. So I could just, quickly talk to that one. So an AEFI, so the adverse event following immunisation, is kind of a broader term than the adverse event of special interest. So the AEFI is something which, anything that could happen after a vaccination. So an injection site reaction, all the kind of expected events. Whereas when you're talking about the adverse events of special interest, these are the ones which you've identified as being a possibility might occur with following the vaccine based on experience with previous vaccines. And these tend to be the more serious, the more life-threatening or possibly fatal events. And I think we talked a little bit about these yesterday, and my colleague Jo Lynn did go through these in the first module on ADR reporting. So things like sudden death and autoimmune disease, things like thrombocytopenia and Guillain-Barré syndrome. So that's the difference between those two terms. So when you're talking about an AESI, that is an AEFI, but it's a kind of a subdivision that you might be more interested in.
Great, thank you. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming through. So we are able to finish ahead of time. As always, we'd ask you to complete the poll of the standard questions that help us evaluate how we're doing. And we do have module 3, 4 and 5 coming up in the coming months, and dates will be confirmed, at least for module 3. I think quite shortly. So look out for your emails there. So colleagues, Lily, Catherine, thank you so much again. And to all attendees, thank you for your attention, and we'll see you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.